Fifth Hour Radio Show.
Mike, we usually like to start off our shows getting an idea, of how our guests first got the itch, to do what they're known for doing. In your case, it's acting. So, when did you first get that acting bug?
I dated back to probably when I was 10 or 12 years old. I had an older sister who brought movie magazines home. We lived in West Hollywood, which was then not a city. It was part of the Los Angeles County, a strip of the Los Angeles County that wasn't incorporated. And my dad worked in the studios, and I went to grammar school with Natalie Wood, and so it was all around us. But I think my sister's bringing the movie magazines home kind of sealed the deal for me. I was looking at these stories about people, not a whole lot older than I was, who were actors, and they were getting all this attention and what I thought was love, and it looked to me like it was a way to solve all my problems.
And it pays pretty good too.
Well, if you get the work, it does. Yeah.
I know you had a couple parts in the films, The Graduate and the Americanization of Emily, but do you consider your role as Scott Banning on Days of Our Lives possibly your first big break?
It was, yeah. As a serious actor, that was my first one. I had done, as you suggest, a couple of walk-on roles, one line, a couple of lines, that sort of thing. But in one instance, it's a movie called, I'm on a blank on it. Angie Dickinson and Greg Peck were in it, but I've forgotten Captain Newman, M.D. It was called. I didn't have any line at all. We just jumped up and down on a bed and shouted out extemporaneous lines when Angie Dickinson walked into the hospital ward that I was supposed to be a patient in. But at any rate, sure, Days of Our Lives was the beginning of where people began to notice that I was, an actor. I had done a lot of stage work, but on film, most of what I had done was these little bit parts and television commercials by that time.
Now, do you keep up with soap operas these days? Do you have a favorite?
No, I don't. I never watched soaps except when I had the opportunity when I was on it. I never watched soaps before and never watched soaps since.
I think the only time I was ever hooked on a soap just so happened to be Days of Our Lives. And I can remember going over to my mom's house and watching it with her. And that's back when Marlena, played by Deidre Hall, she was like possessed by a demon. Did they ever go?
Lord.
Yeah. Did they ever go to that extreme as far as storylines back in your day as a cast member?
No, they didn't. No, it was all very, I won't say mundane, but it was, there was issues of illegitimate children and broken marriages and that sort of thing. But no, there was none of the far out stuff that kind of came into the picture later.
Now, back in those early days of your career, did you ever find yourself starstruck when meeting, or possibly working with someone you've only seen on TV or the big screen?
Oh, always, sure. I mean, I was starstruck just generally watching people in the films when I was in the audience. But when I got to work on Days of Our Lives, McDonald Carey was the sort of chief, lead, along with Francis Reed. And then the next year, I went to work on a show called The Interns, and Brad Crawford was the, an Academy Award-winning actor, was our mentor, doctor. And then the year after that, I went to work with Anthony Quinn. So I was starstruck, you might say, the whole time, and have continued to be.
As far as your most memorable role, as B.J. Hunnicutt on m.a.s.h, and you might be thinking right now, oh gosh, m.a.s.h, here we go again. But was there
I'm happy to talk about m.a.s.h.
Was there an audition process for that, or were you handpicked for that role?
It was a kind of a combination of both. I was interviewed for it. They asked if I would come over. I was under contract to Universal at this time after having been working with Tony Quinn and doing a couple movies and a couple of other shows at Universal. And I didn't even know if it was legal or possible for me to do the show, but my agent said they wanted to meet me, so I went over and met with Reynolds and Larry Gelbart and Burt Metcalf, who I had known as a casting director earlier, and we just talked, and I had some ideas, and they had some ideas, and they asked me how I felt about this and that. But they also said, we're not even sure at this point if Wayne is serious about not coming back, so we can't promise anything. And I said I understood that. But then, short time later, they asked if I would consider coming in and doing a screen test. And the reason they made clear, because I had already done, as we just discussed, 2 television series and a soap, they wasn't that I could act. It was to see what the chemistry was like with Alan. And I said, of course, I would be happy to do that. And they tested me and 2 other actors, and I got lucky.
Yeah. How much of the real personality of Mike Farrell did you bring to the character of B.J.? I know you had scripts, but were there a lot of improv allowed?
No, well, we didn't. It's a little difficult to explain, but the scripts were very carefully written. And when we had an idea for something during rehearsal day, we would try it out. And if it worked, the writers or the producer would take a look at it and say yes or no. But generally speaking, the stuff we did was what was written. And in the instance when something we suggested was deemed to work, then they'd write it into the script. That's what we do. But on the shoot days, we weren't making changes. We were shooting what was written.
Mm-hmm. So many people were glued to the TV. That final episode. And I know at least my mother and grandmother had tears coming down their faces at that final goodbye scene. What was it just as tough for the cast and crew to say goodbye to each other, as it was for America to say goodbye to the series?
Oh, of course it was. Yeah, I mean, it was. We actually shot that film we had to do a couple of episodes of the series after we shot the film, because the film being as long as it was required a lot more time in post-production. And we knew, we made the decision to end the show, and we knew that we were saying goodbye to each other in a very serious way, because what we wanted to do, our idea about ending the show was to have the opportunity to say goodbye to each other in character, and to say goodbye and thank you to each other as actors, and to say goodbye and thank you to the audience. So we knew it going in, but when we shot the film, I remember Burt Metcalf, who was directing at that time, said that I've never had a situation to tell actors to not cry so much.
I bet.
Yeah.
Just a quick question while I'm thinking about it. Where was m.a.s.h filmed at? Was it, the location?
Well, the exteriors where we were, usually one day out of every show, anytime we needed big equipment or any kind of vista, we're out at what was then the 20th Century Fox Ranch out in Malibu Canyon. Now it's called Malibu Creek State Park. It's been taken over by the state. But most of what we shot was on stage at 20th Century Fox, Stage 9.
Yeah, I mean, I just had to ask that because to me as a kid when I was watching it, I always believed you were right there in Korea because it was shot so well.
Yeah, and Jamie Farr, who played Corporal Klinger, was the only one of the cast members who had ever been in Korea. He was there with Bob Hope when he was in the Army. And he said that area looked remarkably like Korea, so they really picked well.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've also hosted Saving the Wildlife for PBS, the best of the National Geographic specials, and you got to scuba dive with your children, Michael and Aaron, in French Polynesia for the World of Audubon. I have to ask, what's it like swimming with sharks? And even more, what was it like swimming with sharks with your children?
Well, the idea of doing this thing was very attractive, of course, and then we had to, when the producers agreed that I could take my and that the kids and I would do some of the diving, take a scuba course in order to be licensed in order to do it, and we did our studies in a swimming pool, and then we did our studies off the coast of California. But getting out into the South Pacific was something. Was really exciting and quite wonderful. But when we saw all those sharks, when we were going through the one of the passes in Rangiroa Atoll, I was somewhat concerned, I must say, but the kids were very courageous and they just went for it. And then there was a time I saw a shark swimming toward them, and I thought, man, I'm going to get down there and get in between that shark and my kid.
Yeah.
And I thought, at the time, I thought, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. Shark, if he wants to go through me to get to them, he's gonna have it his way. But he just looked us over and kept on going. Thank heaven.
Yeah, that was really cool. Are you a big animal lover? I personally am now. I used to be a hunter, but almost 7 years ago, when I was married to my wife, she quote unquote cured me of that disease.
Uh-huh. Yes, I am. I'm a vegetarian and actually a vegan, and I'm an animal lover and a supporter of animal rights, and so I'm not a hunter at all,
Mm-hmm.
nor am I a fisherman for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I found interesting is you were elected the first vice president of the Screen Actors Guild back in 2002, and it says there on your page that you served 3 years in that position. I got to ask you,
that's right.
Why did you run for that position? And second, once you were elected, was it everything you expected, or were there more duties involved than what you thought?
Well, it's certainly a very serious position. I did it because there were some problems with the union, inside the union. There was a group of actors who were, in my view, off base in the way they were orchestrating things on the board, the Screen Actors Guild board, and as the officers of the union. And I was very much in opposition to them. And a group came together to try to oust them to run for office. And Melissa Gilbert said she would run for president and asked me if I would run as her vice president. And I said, sure, to be supportive. And then it surprised me a little bit. We won, and then I spent the 3 years being the vice president, and that meant presiding over this boardroom where a lot of the people were the ones we had defeated and were representative of the ones we had defeated. And they were still on the board, which made it a little uncomfortable, I must say, but ultimately we prevailed.
Before we wrap this up, I'm compelled to ask you about your role as an activist. I believe everyone has an opinion, their own opinions on right and wrong in this world, but very few act on them. Why do you think it's in your nature to get so involved in your personal beliefs?
I was raised in a pretty strict Irish Catholic family. My dad was a very tough guy. He was a hard-drinking, two-fisted Irishman who was a fighter. He was a brawler. And he was scary. And the bottom line is I grew up as a very frightened child. And as I grew older, I found that I was identifying. My dad died when I was a teenager, but I found that I was identifying with people who were victimized or oppressed by others, by stronger, tougher, more powerful people. And that has, when I realized that, I identified with the black people in the civil rights movement, or brown people in the Brown Revolution, or gay people when the gays were trying to get their rights for them. It just seemed to me that we, as members of this society, have an obligation to be involved when there are things happening that we think are wrong. And for me, the Vietnam War was wrong, so I was opposed to it. For me, the civil rights movement was right, and so I was supportive of it. And that's been the sort of my behavior and my belief system for many, many years. I think that the prison system is screwed up, so I'm a prison reform advocate. I think the death penalty is wrong, so I'm a death penalty opponent. I'm a human rights activist. I believe that human beings are worth more than a lot of people seem to think they are, and that we need to be responsive to the needs of people to have a better life than is given them under certain circumstances.
Now, do you got anything on your plate right now? Any upcoming projects?
Yeah, I've been working on a play. It's going to be a one-man play. I've done it a few times, and because of the circumstances of the play, some of the script has to be reworked, but it's about a scientist who, it's a true story about a scientist who became one of the pioneers of the understanding of the impact of carbon dioxide, CO2, on the atmosphere, and why we're having the weather problems we're having. And it's I think a very socially aware piece that's going to tell people that who have some doubts about global warming that there is a lot for us to be concerned about, and a lot we need to be doing as a society to help save the earth.
Now, can you direct our listeners to maybe some of your social media or websites you got to learn a little bit more about you and your projects you got on the horizon?
Well, you sound as though you reached Mike Farrell online. It's MikeFarrell.org, www.MikeFarrell.org. That's the website where most of the information that's available to me. Also, people who go there can get information about things I've done. They can look at the journals I've written about trips I've taken in different parts of the world. www.deathpenalty.org is the website for the death penalty organization I chair. HRW.org is the human rights organization I was part of I was a co-chair out here in California for 10 years. But, there are a lot of things people can look for if they're interested in the things I'm interested in. And the website, the MikeFarrell.org, can steer them in some directions, I think.
Well, Mike, I want to thank you for spending this little bit of time with me today. It's been an honor, and it's been fun, too. I wish you luck in, everything you do.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right.
The 25th Hour Radio Show.